Okay, so what I'd like to do now is explain to you a little bit about how the mind works. Now, the first thing I'd like to explain is our brains are formed in the first 2 weeks of life, and we make absolutely millions of brain cells which have to be squeezed into a relatively tiny place. And that's why our brains look so convoluted, because there's just so many brain cells in there. So, just now, referring to the brain and the part above your eyes and behind your forehead, here's the part of the brain we know as the prefrontal cortex. And specifically, the left prefrontal cortex is the part that you know as you. It's where your personality resides. It's where you have all your thoughts and interactions with the world. It's the part of the brain that the textbooks refer to as the conscious mind. And experts have decided that this probably represents a very tiny 10% of the total mind. But I'm sure both you and I both know that when we run our lives intellectually, we actually do quite a good job. So now let's face it, no one actually consciously decides to have a panic attack or become depressed or whatever. So we know that this must be a very subconscious response. So we have the left prefrontal cortex, and into the left prefrontal cortex comes the 5 senses. Everything you see, you hear, you feel, touch or taste. They're all registering in there, as all your thoughts as well. Now the subconscious mind, or the unconscious mind, we're looking at the yellow part now on the diagram. We call that part of your mind the emotional mind, or the primitive mind. We also call it the security officer, or the health and safety officer. So at the front, behind your forehead, the left prefrontal cortex is the boss, and down the yellow part at the bottom, that's the amygdala. We call that the primitive, or the emotional mind, the security officer, or the health and safety officer. It's lower down, it's just between the temples and the tops of the ears, where the fingers meet in the middle, in the deepest, very deepest part of your brain. It's very, very well protected there. It shows up on that diagram as the yellow area. It's about the size of a walnut, and this part of your mind has no direct contact with the outside world. Now the horseshoe-shaped bit, that's also the pink bit in the middle. This is the part that we call the anterior cingulate. It's known as the secretary. So we've got the security officer, which is the amygdala. The secretary, the anterior cingulate. And your intellectual mind, or the conscious mind, which you know as the boss. So it's the secretary who processes all the information that comes into the intellectual mind. Processes the 5 senses of sight, sound, touch, speech and taste. It's all processed through the intellectual mind by the secretary, and whether or not the emotional mind gets involved is decided by what the secretary matches up with the experience. A bit more on this later though. So now, coming back to that security, or the health and safety officer. It's important not to become too critical of the subconscious or the unconscious mind, whatever you like to call it, because it runs all the functions of the whole body and the mind. It allows us to breathe naturally without even thinking about how to breathe. It allows the heart to keep pumping without having to think about it. How you can put one foot in front of the other without consciously making any effort to work out which group of muscles you need to use, and so on. And overall does a pretty good job, and I'm sure you'll agree. Now your subconscious mind operates with the help of an enormous model library of information, and the response patterns which are in this library will determine our behaviour and thought patterns throughout the day, every single day. Somewhere in our brains are stored absolutely everything about how to react to this, how to react to that, how to do this, how to do that, and so on. So now when we have a problem, let's say perhaps with spiders, or maybe the wind, or flying, or mice, or something like that, somewhere in your mind, at the back of the brain, that's above the secretary and behind the intellectual mind, somewhere in our mind we have what we call a library book, or a template, whatever you like to call it. And basically that template, that library book that says that these things like spiders, wind, flying mice, whatever, are not safe things. Now, in actual fact, you're using your templates of your library right now. Your intellectual mind, that's the boss, is reporting to your subconscious mind what's going on now, where you are right now. As you're listening to me right now, your secretary is checking everything that's coming into your conscious mind that you're hearing. Maybe what you're seeing, noticing the temperature, what's around you, that sort of thing. And your secretary is busy searching through this library of information and response patterns to come back with the right set of responses. And it's doing a very quick, a very lightning search, so fast we can't really measure it. And it'll be bringing you back with an appropriate response, which might be perhaps feeling comfortable, smiling, maybe nodding your head, flickering your eyes, because that's quite normal. So you'll be coming back with the right set of responses for just sitting comfortably listening to this. Now, if for instance later today or tomorrow you're out and about and you ran into something dangerous, let's say a polar bear in the car park, the response will be something, and before you have a chance to even think what you need to do, your secretary has registered that sight, sound, maybe even a smell, whatever it was. Your secretary has registered that, checked your library, made a lightning search in the library facility, and the bodily response would be that the amygdala, or health and safety or security officer, has been put on standby into full flight mode, even perhaps by the secretary, and without even realising what you've got to do, your body responds instantly. It might break out into a sweat, your heart might really start to beat, your stomach would perhaps churn, and your legs would grow wings, and you'd be off out of that car park like grease lightning. Now you realise there are some differences between these two examples of how our conscious mind communicates with our subconscious mind. And in psychological terms, the difference is quite profound. Being wherever you are now, sitting comfortably listening to this, your subconscious doesn't perceive your position to be a dangerous one. So you remain in that intellectual control. However, if you were to run into, say, a polar bear or whatever, then your subconscious would just automatically be in charge and completely take over your actions and thought processes. Every time your subconscious thinks, for whatever reason, that you're facing a life-threatening event, that your life is in some kind of crisis, that there's an emergency, then our primitive mind, our security officer, takes over all our physical and mental functions and gets us out of that dangerous position, that life-threatening situation. Whether it's being face-to-face with a spider or a mouse or an aeroplane. Because our subconscious mind works to protect our lives. Now when the subconscious mind moves in to help, it moves in with the three primitive patterns of response. We know these primitive patterns of response today as anxiety, anger and depression. And the primitive mind can move in with all three, or it can move in with perhaps two of them. A combination of two, or it might move in with a combination of all three of them. Depression, anxiety, anger. These are all feelings that are primitive opt-out of life clauses. Okay, so let's go back to when we were cavemen and cavewomen. When caveman looked out of his cave in the morning and it was, say, pouring with rain or foggy ice, snow, or even there was a forest fire, maybe a herd of woolly mammoths going by, he wouldn't go out to hunt and he'd probably stay in his cave. Basically, he turned inward, didn't interact with the world outside until the situation improved. Now, if you and I were back in the jungle in those days, we'd probably be pretty close to our panic button most of the time. We really would be likely to come across lots of wild animals, be it a bear, a tiger or mammoth, or even those rather unfriendly wild tribesmen from across the hill with whom we have that sort of neighbourly kill or be killed part relationship. I'm pretty sure we'd both have mental thumbs hovering over our mental panic buttons probably most of the time. Now, as a result of these experiences by early man, we're left with a primitive way of increasing our strength when there's a problem. And we understand that today is the anger response. In the old caveman days, the anger response would be in order to run away from a predatory bear or to kill our neighbour, whatever was the appropriate action. And today, it just tends to be the anger response that our subconscious brain comes up with, rather than the kill or be killed response that primitive man needed. So can you see there's a direct relationship between anxieties and intellectual control? When our anxiety goes up, we lose that intellectual control. As our anxiety level increases, perhaps we see that polar bear or maybe a mouse, we automatically lose intellectual control. And our primitive mind, or our subconscious mind, the security officer or health and safety officer, automatically responds to the situation in order to save our lives. In life, we don't tend to come across polar bears in the car park, well, not around here anyway, but we do have the pressures of life, everyday life. Telephone, the bills, the workload, the children, all sorts of everyday problems which build up and increase our anxiety levels. When these levels rise too high, then we lose that intellectual control and our primitive mind steps in and takes over. Now remember that I mentioned earlier the primitive mind works within the parameters of depression, anxiety and anger, and these are all opting out clauses. They're forms of behaviour that gets us out of situations. They get us out of situations that our subconscious mind has been given the impression are life endangering. So let me tell you a little more about the primitive mind, or the security officer. It's actually a negative mind. It's negative because it's there for our self-preservation. Our primitive mind will always encourage us to see things from the worst possible scenario. Now, the primitive mind is a very vigilant mind. It's obsessive, but most of all, because our primitive mind isn't an intellect, it can't be innovative. It always has to refer back to the previous patterns of behaviour. So why is it the subconscious mind thinks your life is in such crisis that it has to move in? Well, everyone faces problems of one sort or another at some time or other. Some of us cope better than others with the same problems. Some of us see the same problems as challenges, opportunities, and yet others amongst us will see insurmountable problems. Now, it can't just be the events in your life. Otherwise, it would mean everyone who's involved in the same situation as you, members of your household, your family, your neighbours, people at work, people you go and brush shoulders with in the supermarket, they would all be suffering from exactly the same type of problems that you're suffering. So I know it may sound strange to hear this, but the reason you're experiencing what you're experiencing is because of your thought patterns surrounding the events in your life as you perceive them. As you perceive them. Now remember that the subconscious mind relies on our thought patterns to determine how our life is. The negative thoughts are transferred into feelings of anxiety. Negative thoughts are transferred into feelings of anxiety. And did you know that our subconscious mind can't tell the difference between imagination and reality? When we imagine something happening, so far as our subconscious mind is concerned, it's as if it's happening now. So even saying something, our subconscious mind will be acting on those very words as if they are reality. And every time you recall past events that weren't happy ones, your subconscious mind feels that you are experiencing them again every time you think about these events. Now, there are two main ways in which we can create negativity. The first is when we negatively forecast the future. Remember what I said, the subconscious cannot tell the difference between imagination and reality. It has no connection with the outside world. your left prefrontal cortex, your intellectual mind, understands time, past, present, future. The rest of your brain has no concept of time. It only understands now. So, for example, if you were to say, I'll never be able to afford that, or I'll never be able to cope with doing that, or I'll never get any promotion, or saying I'll never have any luck, then your subconscious mind, or your primitive mind, that negative mind, is put into the reaction of dealing with these words as if they had already happened. It's a bit like saying, I'll be late. I'll be late. No matter how much planning or preparation you do, you sent the instructions to your primitive mind, to your security officer via your secretary and library, to make sure that you're late. For that's the instruction you've asked for. You've asked to be late. Because the brain doesn't understand the negative. All it hears is, I'm going to be late. And your mind will react with anxiety, anger or depression in some way or other. It might just be those small things like, I'm going to be late for work, I'm bound to forget that, and your subconscious mind will be processing these words as if you're already late for work, as if you'd already forgotten what it was. Now, of course, you know intellectually that nothing can go wrong if you plan for nothing to go wrong. But because you said that something might go wrong, your subconscious has processed it as having already gone wrong, and suddenly you worry, you become anxious or depressed. The depressed state sets in and possibly even get angry with yourself, perhaps with others, about whatever it is that's going wrong, even before it's really begun. So now the second way we can create negativity is when we negatively introspect about the past. Again, it can be the big things. I'm sure you know the kind of things you say to yourself, oh, I wish I hadn't have done that, or I wish that hadn't have happened. Why did I do that? But it can also be those small things, like perhaps you go to a meeting and the meeting probably went well, but when you get out of the meeting place, you start to think, why did I say that? What do you think they'll think of me? And you'll be wondering what they'll be thinking of you for doing whatever you did or said whatever you did. Maybe you'll wonder if they wonder what you meant when you said that such, and you'll probably worry about what they meant and when they said whatever it was they said. I'm sure you know the sort of things I mean, and this kind of negativity is always converted into anxiety. And our imagination is a marvellous resource. It's just that sometimes we just end up misusing it. Now, scientists have worked out there's a mechanism in the brain that's there to help us deal with anxiety, and it's called rapid eye movement, REM. And we have REM, that's rapid eye movement, at night during our sleep periods. And it's when we rerun the negative events from the day. We get about 2 hours of REM every night. It's a very approximate kind of figure, but maybe 20 minutes about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you get 5 minutes here and another 2 minutes there, perhaps an hour or so during the night maybe. All these bits will add up to about approximately 2 hours, about an 80-20 rule of REM sleep. And the rest of the night is just pure rest time. So when we're asleep and in our REM period of sleep, our eyelids are fluttering. It's when our REM pattern is working as it should be. When we wake up in the morning feeling free from any upsets from the previous day. Now, I like to think of this process as a bucket. So during the day, everything that we haven't been able to manage, like we haven't been able to sort out a bill that came in incorrectly, or we haven't sorted out that argument, or whatever it happened to be, whatever it might be, just piles into your bucket. And your bucket sits in your left prefrontal cortex, in the intellectual mind, and during the night sleep, anything that's not resolved, i.e. the argument that's not being sorted out, will be in your REM bucket needing attention. Sometimes you can clear your REM bucket with one night's sleep, and that's good. And this is when we're having a full night of quality sleep and handling life really well. Now, remember when I mentioned about spiders or mice getting on an aeroplane, all that sort of thing, maybe standing at a height? Well, you may have had an overflowing REM bucket on a day where something happened with a mouse or a spider. Or maybe you were by a height or by water perhaps, and your bucket was near full, and you're not able to empty it. So now that spider, that fear of flying, whatever it happens to be, has been mismatched in your library by the secretary part of your brain. So just let me give you an example. You know when you see cats and dogs and they're in their sleep and they're twitching and their little paws and their noses are going, well, when they're doing this, they're in their REM part of their sleep, and just like humans, it's unwise to disturb them. Let them run through whatever is going through their minds so they wake up free from whatever it is that's on their mind. They actually catch that mouse that they missed early in the day, or they found that bone that they can't find where they buried it anywhere. Now, if we create more negativity than our REM period that can cope with for one reason or another, not getting enough REM sleep, whatever, then we begin to build up a surplus of anxiety. And it's that surplus of anxiety that causes us to lose that intellectual control. So if you can imagine a bucket that's full in your intellectual mind, and you find it's a bit like the RAM on a computer. If you've got too many programs open, your RAM just starts to slow down, and this is what happens with the intellectual mind when your bucket's full. When we have this full bucket, the surplus of anxiety causes us to lose that intellectual control. This surplus of anxiety that prompts the subconscious mind to evaluate our life as being in crisis, and when our lives are in crisis, that primitive mind or the security officer responds again with depression, anxiety or anger. Either one of these, a combination of them all, or even all three. Our security officer takes control. Its job is to keep you alive and out of harm's way. So what it does, it does the best it can. Keeps you out of harm's way, reacting with depression, withdrawing from life. Anxiety being hyper alert, or the anger response, which is making sure you've got full strength to cope with whatever you've got to cope with. So what we're going to do together is to reduce your levels of anxiety, helping you get the real you back again. Now I want to explain a bit about the physiology, about what happens to the brain when we suffer from things like anxiety disorders, depression or whatever, anger, so on. So about 20,000 years ago, scientists have realised now that early man and early women were given quite definite rewards for carrying out certain evolutionary processes. For example, they went out hunting and gathering. Their reward was to have food to eat. When they interacted with others, they had company. When men and women got together and had a family, there was a purpose to their lives, and their tribe would grow in numbers. And scientists have confirmed that early man was aware of these rewards for certain actions. They're quite adamant about this to their finding. The rewards of eating and commuting were man's early motivations to go out and hunt and mix with the opposite members of the sex within the tribe, and even with members of their own sex. And this was early man's motivation, not going hungry and having relationships. But most of all, it was a coping mechanism. Their immediate rewards for their daily activities, are hunting and communication, helped them with these activities and helped them cope with physical fear and making them brave enough to hunt the animals they needed to hunt. Talk to members of the opposite sex in order to start a family, and all these sort of things, to set up communities for the safety in numbers and the distribution of tasks that would have made their life that little bit easier. And it probably even helped them cope better with physical pain, and obviously made them feel much happier as well. Now, of course, these days we know what their reward was and still is. It's a chemical response in the brain that produces various neurotransmitters that act as catalysts for that sort of mentally healthy behaviour. And the most important neurotransmitter is called serotonin. When we're producing a lot of healthy serotonin, there's a good steady flow around the brain. That's when we're most happy and healthy, and happy, coping, brave little souls, in fact. So when we're operating in these positive parameters like early man, we're producing patterns in the brain that give us a constant flow of this neurotransmitter chemical, the serotonin. When we have a natural flow of serotonin, which is our personal happy drug flowing through our bodies, 10% in the brain, 9% in the body, and this in turn creates a natural made noradrenaline, which is our motivation drug. This creates our naturally made success drug known as dopamine, and this latter can be described as the cocaine of life. So although we don't have to go out hunting for our foods these days, we do have to interact with people all around us. And when we interact with the world around us in a positive way, when we do things positively, when we think positively, and the pattern of brainwaves we produce ensures there's lots of serotonin, a good constant flow of serotonin, which in turn creates noradrenaline and dopamine. Now, of course, you're probably wondering what stops the flow of that serotonin. So, well, you know that when we're down at the unsociable end, the depressed end of life, tackling life in the awful sort of way, we don't produce any natural chemicals at all. And when we're up at the anxious end, we produce an overdose, an overload of adrenaline. It's the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Whether we're running away from hungry lions, we don't need to digest our breakfast. And this is how we end up with things like IBS and other digestive problems. Adrenaline's great for when you run into that polar bear in the car park, but it's no good for running our daily lives in and around where we live. Not hereabouts anyway, where it's safe. And your adrenal glands are not meant to be so overworked. They're probably getting pretty exhausted, and we need to give them a break. So by having some good positive thoughts, we can interact and react in a sociable way with people, being physically active and all these sort of things. You can begin to create your own serotonin, your noradrenaline, dopamine, and this becomes a really good positive growth cycle of events. When we crave serotonin, this is when we look for chocolate, cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana and carbohydrates, as they all contain that compound that's similar to serotonin. Like the picture in the jigsaw, it's not quite right-shaped chemical composition, so we cannot make the required chemicals to keep us in a positive mode. So we get our highs and then we get our lows as the artificial serotonin wears off, and guess what? We need that, for example, that nicotine fix, that alcohol fix, that chocolate fix, whatever it happens to be. So smiling at yourself, thinking about the good times in your life, the ones that you've had and the ones that you can have again, being physically active, listening to music that you enjoy, meeting up with friends, reading a good book. It takes you right out of yourself. Watching that comical, funny film, or all these things can really help you create your own serotonin. So, now do you remember what I said about REM and where we have our REM sleep? We move what's in our REM bucket from what we call an emotional into a narrative memory. It's all about getting a good night's rest. It's the 80-20 rule of restful body sleep and 20% REM time. That helps us understand how to live our lives and laying down of those good library templates. So we need to put quality food in our bodies to feed our mind with the right things. So eating good food like lean meat, fish and fresh vegetables, fruits, cutting back on those carbohydrates, the alcohol and chocolate will ensure that you don't have a sluggish system. Now I want you to remember that every journey starts with a single step. There are things in life that we can control and things we cannot control, like King Canute and the tide. So if there's something in your life that you cannot change, then leave it and move on. Do not give it energy that you can use for something that's much better for you. Finally, what I like to use, what we do here is we use trance, and trance is a very positive state of mind. It's very natural. We slip in and out of trance many times a day when we're doing something like perhaps walking to the shops or driving to the shops. How many times have you left home and suddenly arrived at your destination and completely forgotten about the way you've come? That's a natural trance. It's a very, very natural state of being, and we use that here in hypnosis and hypnotherapy in order to access your subconscious, bringing positive messages straight and directly into your brain. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand a little bit about how the brain works, and if you've got any questions, please ask me next time you see me.